Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Janesville Performing Arts Center. Thank you for coming to JPAC Your Lunch. We're happy to have you all here today. A couple of things that I wanted to mention that are coming up here at JPAC. Of course, The Wizard of Oz opens tonight. Spotlight on Kids is producing The Wizard of Oz. It is a huge cast, including all the kids playing Munchkins. They have a cast of 84, and they're doing all sorts of things that have never been done on the JPAC stage before. They're going to have special effects and all these visual effects. It's going to be really, really amazing. So I've heard lots of great things about it. So tonight is pay what you can night. So no real admission. They'll just pass the hat. And then the show will be Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. So come on out and follow the Yellow Brick Road. In August, Theater Unlimited is producing The Music Man. And, of course, everybody knows The Music Man and Harold Hill, so you can look forward to that. That will be August 18th through the 21st here at JPAC. And Richard Marks is going to be the lead performer, the featured performer for our 7th anniversary celebration. That's coming up September 17th and 18th, Saturday and Sunday. All seats on Sunday are $10, and I've been told those are going very, very fast. Richard Marks, who had a string of hit records in the 80s, so be sure to mark that on your calendar. And then Halloween night, something I'm personally very excited about. We are doing another radio show here at JPAC. We're going to do a live radio drama on the JPAC stage in front of an audience that is going to be simultaneously broadcast by WCLO Radio. And this year, for Halloween, hopefully you came out and saw War of the Worlds last year. This year we are doing Frankenstein. And we're very excited about it. The version that we're doing, if you've ever seen the Frankenstein movies, this is really nothing like it. This is very faithful to the original novel by Mary Shelley, which is more of a morality play. And the creature actually speaks. He doesn't just grunt and snarl. The creature actually has the mind of a very brilliant professor, and he learns how to speak. And, you know, before the show is over, he's quoting from John Milton. So it's going to be a fascinating radio drama. So that will be Halloween night here at 6:30. So hope to see you all here for that. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our special guest speaker this noon. We're very pleased to have with us Evan Richards of the Madison Savoyards. That group does Gilbert and Sullivan productions every year, and they've got Utopia Limited coming up. It was the last collaboration between Gilbert and Sullivan, and Evan is going to tell us why and wherefore and everything else we would want to know about that production. So, Evan Richards, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to talk about Gilbert and Sullivan. I'm planning to talk a little bit about the Madison Savoyards, a little bit about Gilbert and Sullivan, and a little bit about our current production for this summer. Now, how many of you consider yourself experts at Gilbert and Sullivan? How many are at least familiar with Gilbert and Sullivan? So nobody claims no familiarity with Sullivan or Gilbert. Yeah, well, okay. Usually with an audience, there are people that claim that I don't know anything about Arthur Sullivan, never heard his music, and I always like to say, yes, you have. If you think you haven't heard it, here's a horrible example of one of his tunes. Yep, Onward Christian Soldiers is a Sullivan hymn, and most people are familiar with that. And that is a fairly tacky arrangement, but I was looking for something I could download for free off the web, and it's 101 strings. I haven't heard 101 strings since I was a kid. I didn't know they were still around. Well, the Madison Savoyards was started in 1963. So with a production of Iolanthe, and the idea was to put on the full thing, not so much with sets and costumes, but with a full cast and an orchestra. These were written with a fairly substantial orchestra, and the performance practice, except for the very most professional companies in those days, was a piano. And you really don't get the full effect. So this group started, and they, I think, put it on in the church basement somewhere. And it went over very well, and they decided to do it again, and again, and again, and again. And after a very few years, they added the sets and costumes, and it became a full production. And it's been going on ever since. And it's sort of one of those things that seems to defy gravity a little bit. We have no full-time staff. We don't have an office. We don't. We do have a telephone number, barely. And it just sort of comes together every year, mostly volunteers, and happens. We do pay the orchestra, and we pay a few of the technical staff that runs the production, but it's mostly an amateur production, and it's paid for by mostly the tickets, but we do have a lot of very loyal donors that keep things going, and a few grants from the Dane County Cultural Affairs and Madison City Arts, and up until now anyway, the Wisconsin Arts Board, but probably not anymore. Okay, a little bit about Gilbert and Sullivan. First, let's start with Sullivan. Arthur Seymour Sullivan. When he got to be an adult, he stopped using his middle name. He was tired of people using his initials. Think about it. He was born in 1842. His father was an instructor at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He moved to London. He was a clarinetist in a theater orchestra. Returned to Sandhurst in 1845 when Sullivan was 3 years old as the bandmaster, playing and teaching. Now, Arthur turned out to be somewhat of a musical prodigy. At age 10, he was in the choir of the Royal Chapel Court of St. James Palace. At age 14, he was in the Royal Academy of Music, the Mendelssohn School in Leipzig. And just make note, one of his classmates was Carl Rosa. Mean anything to anybody? Well, we'll get to that later. Carl Rosa was a classmate. At age 19, he became the organist at St. Michael's at Chester Square and at Covent Garden. He was a rather serious composer of classical music. He wrote symphonies, a symphony, cello concerto, incidental music to The Tempest, and hymns, probably the most well-known of which is Onward Christian Soldiers. That he wrote in 1871. So that's Arthur Sullivan, a fairly serious but and fairly well-known classical composer. William Schwenk Gilbert. He's born in 1836. His father inherited wealth, so his father retired at age 25. Nice if you can do it. William got his BA at King's College in London, not Cambridge, London. He worked as a government clerk, a bureaucrat, for 4 years and detested it. He then tried law. He studied law at the Inner Temple in London. He was intending to be a barrister. Now in England, you know, a barrister is the what we would call a criminal attorney, and as opposed to a solicitor, which would be a civil attorney in our parlance. Well, he wasn't too happy with that either. He also spent 20 plus years in the militia, which would be the equivalent of our National Guard. So, big three areas of his experience was the government, sort of in the administrative area, in the bureaucracy, the legal realm, and the military. And so he got this enormous font of fodder for his humor that we see all throughout his later work. He got to be a contributor to a literary humor journal called Fun, and by 1867 he had published his Bab Ballads, which was comic verse, and he also did drawings. And those got to be rather well known, and some of those became at least elements in the later plots and stories of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas. He was a playwright. He also was a producer and owner of a theater. He owned I think it was the Garrick Theater in London for a long, long time. He met Sullivan in 1869. Gilbert was working with Frederick Clay on a production called Ages Ago, long forgotten, but it was a musical thing. And so Gilbert was the playwright and Frederick Clay was the composer for this thing. Clay knew Sullivan and wanted to introduce him to Gilbert. And Gilbert, always being the wit, when they were introduced, this is what he said. "I am very pleased to meet you, Mr. Sullivan, because you will be able to settle a question which has just arisen between Mr. Clay and myself. My contention is that when a musician, who is a master of new instruments, and many instruments, has a musical theme to express, he can express it as perfectly upon the simple tetrachord of Mercury, which there are, as we all know, no diatonic intervals whatsoever, as upon the more elaborate disdiapason, which, with the familiar four tetrachords and the redundant note, which I need not remind you, embraces in all its simple consonants all the single, double, and inverted chords." Gilbert was writing 20 years later, said, "Sullivan reflected for a moment, asked me to oblige him by repeating the question. I did so, and he replied it was a very nice point and he'd like to think it over." And that was 20 years and he hadn't answered it yet. Turned out that Gilbert was quoting from one of his own earlier plays called The Palace of Truth. Anyway, what a character. He never passed up an opportunity to do something crazy. In 1871, John Hollingshead got them together as producer to do a musical work called Thespis. It was put together, kind of thrown together in 3 weeks. They had 1 week of rehearsal. It ran for 80 performances. Significantly, one person who came to see that performance was Richard Doyley Cart. But it was, after it closed, there wasn't any effort to do another. It was kind of an unsatisfactory experience. Now, really, when we talk about Gilbert and Sullivan, we really need to talk about 3 people: Gilbert, Sullivan, and Doyley Cart. Doyley Cart was really the guy that brought them together, was the real businessman and the glue and the genius that brought these two rather different characters together. Doyley Cart was trying to put on lighter opera, comic opera, and was rather upset that there wasn't a body of English comic opera available. They were having to do French opera, which for English people was terribly painful. In 1875, he was running La Paracole, Offenbach's La Paracole, at the Royalty Theater, and it was a great show, and it was entertaining. It tended to be kind of short. And he had a problem, and he met up with Gilbert and said, "I have this problem. I need something short to kind of fill out the evening. Do you have anything that we could use to make a more complete evening?" Gilbert said, "I wrote a little piece that I was intending to collaborate with Carl Rosa. Remember Carl Rosa? Sullivan's classmate in Leipzig. Carl Rosa was another one that was trying to establish an English comic opera tradition. He started an opera company. He did some work. He was trying to build a show and a theater company around his wife, who was a pretty good soprano, I think it was. Anyway, she died. Gilbert had written this piece for intending that Rosa would write the music. With Rosa's wife's death, the whole project got put on the shelf, but here Gilbert had this thing. And so he said to Don Card, I've got this thing. It's going to be about 45 minutes. Maybe it's perfect. I'll go see Carl Rosa, and we'll get the music done, and we're ready to go. It was Richard Doyley Cart that said, no, don't go see Rosa. Go see Sullivan. See, that was his basis of seeing Thespis. So Gilbert did, read the thing to Sullivan, they hit it off, and they wrote Trial by Jury. It was an incredible hit. It ran 300 performances. Everybody was happy. Cart was happy. Gilbert and Sullivan was happy. And so Cart says, let's do a full-length production. This Trial by Jury was 40 minutes. Let's do a whole thing. Excuse me. So Gilbert and Sullivan said yes, but they said, but we want to make some changes in how we do things. Up until that point, it was the producer in the theater that had a lot of say about who was cast and how things ran. And they said, if we're going to do this, we want to do it our way. And what that meant, and this was groundbreaking and set a precedent that probably put musical theater and opera and a lot of things on a very solid foundation for the rest of time. This is the way things are done now. But they said, we want complete control over casting, rehearsals, rehearsal time, everything. The theater guy can run the theater. Artistically, everything will be done our way. They all agreed. And that's their first production then was The Sorcerer, fairly successful. That went so well, the operation went so well, they decided to do another one. And about that time, Richard Doyley Cart was trying to, he bought out the partners that he had formed in this first company for The Sorcerer, bought them out. When the next one was being prepared, the next one was HMS Pinafore. That one was the one that put them absolutely on the map. That took Gilbert and Sullivan, actually they were known as Sullivan and Gilbert before that. They got to be known as Gilbert and Sullivan after that. It ran for 571 performances. That was, at the time, a West End London record. Stood for a long time. Caught on in the USA. It was a big hit. At one time, there were 8 unauthorized productions of Pinafore in New York City going on. When they finally got an official version from that Gilbert and Sullivan and Cart put together in New York, in the opening night chorus, just to kind of see how things went, was one person who normally wasn't in the chorus, and that was W.S. Gilbert himself, was in that chorus that night. Well, Sullivan and, Gilbert were celebrities. This was changed their world completely. Sullivan made a tour of the U.S. And remember, at the U.S. at that time, late 1870s, the West was kind of an interesting place with all the gold and silver money. All these towns had opera houses. So Sullivan toured around the West to see what the possibilities were and kind of familiarize himself with a potential new market. He walked into a bar somewhere out west, and somebody had the mistaken impression that he was Lewis Sullivan, the prize fighter. Challenged him to a fight. And Sullivan was kind of mystified why anybody would want to fight him. But after he had the conversation with this tough guy in the bar, the guy said, "What? Sullivan? What? The chap that wrote up Pinafore?" "Yep." And he bought him a drink. This identity problem, that's a tradition that continues today. Jim sent email in reply to the email that Emily sent kind of setting this thing up, said Gilbert and Sullivan. I thought he was going to speak about Gilbert O'Sullivan. So you see this kind of problem continues to the present. Anyway. So, Cart was just an incredible businessman, and this business of all these unauthorized performances, this thing just got way more popular than they were prepared for. And so the next one, Pirates of Penzance, thought, okay, the copyright laws were a little shaky in those days and didn't offer much protection, but you got more protection in the U.S. if you had the premiere here. And you didn't lose it in England if the premiere was, if you could say it premiered at the same time. So actually, Pirates of Penzance was produced, the official opening was in New York City to keep the copyright, and there were a bunch of people at an English seaside town still reading from the score at the very same time it was being performed in New York to preserve the copyright. Pirates, although it's really popular today, was not maybe as anywhere near as popular, but still extremely well received. D'Oyly Carte stepped up the level of what he was trying to do to protect the shows. One of the later productions, the one after Pirates, Patience, was a spoof on the aesthetic movement. Oscar Wilde was wildly popular in England, but not so much known in the U.S. That show got to be, in the 50s, here, almost unknown. Aesthetic movement, but you're spoofing something that nobody knew this spoof. Well, when we got the hippie craze and all that kind of stuff going on, it was so close to that Patience has come back. Well, so what to do about this great American market that didn't know the aesthetic craze? Well, Oscar Wilde was sent to the U.S. on a speaking tour by D'Oyly Carte. When I was out in Colorado a year ago last fall, we were in Leadville. I was reading some stuff on back of a menu, some kind of colorful local history, and came across a story I had never heard before. Oscar Wilde, and it turned out it was on this tour that was sponsored by Richard D'Oyly Carte, came to Leadville. Leadville at that time was the home of, and I'm forgetting his name, owned a silver mine and an opera house, and was the Bill Gates of his time, probably the richest man in the world. And there's an opera about him and his wife, The Ballad of Baby Doe. But anyway, that was, so they had a thriving arts scene in Leadville in those days. So Oscar Wilde comes to town, and some of the local tough guys thought, well, we'll see about Pretty Boy here, and they offered to take him to dinner, and their agenda was they were going to get him drunk before his talk, so it'd be really embarrassing. So they took him to dinner, and they started plying him with drinks, and guess what? Oscar Wilde could hold his liquor. So when he got up from dinner to go give his talk, apparently unfazed, the guys, his hosts, were face down in the table, literally. And that's now a Leadville legend, and it's all Gilbert and Sullivan. But it gets better. By the time they got to the Mikado, which by any standard was the most popular and still is of the Gilbert and Sullivan, he had this, it was based on a Japanese theme, because things Japanese were very popular in England at the time. There was a sort of a cultural fair going on in Kensington at the time. And so one thing that these GNS productions emphasized was authenticity. The set for Pinafore was down to the detail, the HMS Victory in Portsmouth Harbor, right? And so little details had to be authentic. Well, the costumes had to be authentic. They actually hired some Japanese people to coach them on how to walk, how to manage the fans. And he bought up all the silk for costumes that was available and put out feelers all over Europe and the US for other suppliers, and said anybody that starts buying lots of silk, he wanted to know about it, because that probably meant somebody was trying to put on an unauthorized version of the Mikado. Well, sure enough, just as, and Cart started doing things that's pretty standard now. Well, the Mikado was running in London. He was preparing companies to be traveling around Europe or around England, so the touring companies. So they were rehearsing. And he got the word that there was somebody in New York that was planning to open about 2 or 3 weeks hence. And so Cart had someone under a different name rent a theater in New York. He showed up at a rehearsal one night of this other company that was rehearsing, they thought, for a trip around England, and told them, go home, do not tell anybody where you're going or what you're doing. Be back here at the theater at midnight, packed for a long absence. And we'll tell you about it later. They came back to the theater. He took them over to the station and put them on a special train to Liverpool. They got off the train, got on a tugboat, went out into the harbor and got on a Cunard liner that was already cast off and already sitting in the out away from shore. These people got on, assumed names. Same thing in New York. Before they got to the pier, another boat met them, got off the boat. He opened that show just ahead of the pirate version in New York. I mean, the guy was just an incredible businessman. Well, the stories go on and about Gilbert and Sullivan and their collaboration. They ended up with 14 if you count Thespis, 13 if you count only the Doyley Cart collaborations. Utopia Limited, the one we're doing in Madison this summer, is the second last production. Some of our material had an error and said it was the last. It was the second last. That opened in 1893. And that was the year of the World's Fair in Chicago, the Columbian Exhibition. It was after a huge argument, after the Gondoliers, which was the previous show. There was both Gilbert and Sullivan, but Gilbert maybe a little more than Sullivan, was interested in the finances, to the point that when telephones were invented, Gilbert was one of the first people that had a telephone put in his house. And it worked its way into the lyrics of Pinafore right away. When they take off Captain Corcoran and take him down to the brig, one of the lines is, "No telephone communicates with his cell." That was, amusing reference because the telephone's brand new. And of course it wouldn't be on the ship, but they threw it in. The telephone was so that somebody at the Savoy Theater could call up Gilbert every night and report the box office receipts. They devised a code for that. So he was keeping track. Well, at some point, there was a new carpet installed and some other things, and Gilbert's monthly check was, or quarterly check or whatever it was, he thought was way, way low. And he took Cart to court. Sullivan sided with Cart, not on the merits of but just because Gilbert was against Cart, Sullivan decided just to be a contrarian. This went on in court, and actually, it turned out that Gilbert was right. There's a lot of stuff that we know about this collaboration and the finances that are a result of the court records. Kind of like today, you know, we learn things from these court records. And it turned out that over the time up until that court case, each one of the partners had profited by something like 800,000 pounds, which was real money in those days. And the court found that actually Cart had shortchanged them. There were some mistakes. And when it was all over, Cart had to pony up some more money to both Gilbert and Sullivan. And just as things were starting to kind of warm back up between Gilbert and Sullivan, Cart kind of threw gasoline on the fire by reminding Sullivan that he actually got some money out of this thing that he was on the other side of the case, and so it got all... So there was a long gap after the Gondoliers until another show came along. When they finally put it together, Cart was going way out of his way to keep the peace between all of them. Sullivan, throughout the partnership, thought he was really a serious composer, and he was, this whole comic opera thing was just kind of beneath him. You know, it just wasn't dignified. Partly things that fed into that, people told him that, including the Queen. Sullivan was knighted. It was Sir Arthur Sullivan, but it wasn't Sir William Gilbert, because some of those lyrics, some of those characterizations of the government and the military, well, we are not amused, right? It was Edward, when he finally became king, knighted Gilbert. So eventually he was Sir William Gilbert, but not during the collaboration. Cart had gone to the lengths of saying, okay, you're a serious composer, you want to write the English Grand Opera. He built him an opera house, another Cart. He had built the Savoy Theater, which during the run of Patience, that was the first theater in the world that was electrically lit, by the way. And if you've seen some of the movies, there's that scene where, well, they had gas lights, and people were kind of afraid of electric lights still. So they had the gas lights on the first night, and Cart came out with a light bulb on a long cord. He took a white handkerchief, put it over it, hammer, smashed the bulb, then showed the handkerchief was not burned or destroyed in any way. Applause, said, okay, so he turned down the gas lights, turned on the electric lights, and you know, that was showmanship. And they had their own electric power plant, by the way, right next to the theater. The theater still exists, and it's right next to the Savoy Hotel in London. Anyway, he built a Royal English Opera House for the premiere of Ivanhoe, January 1891. There were a lot of good things said about it. It ran for an opera fairly long, but generally kind of a commercial failure, and that really didn't go anywhere. So it was in this atmosphere of this very tenuous kind of peacemaking between Gilbert and Sullivan and the distracted Sullivan with his grand opera thing that Utopia Limited came along. That one of the points of tension was gondoliers cost a lot of money, let's have something that costs less. Well, you know how that goes. I know it was something like 5,000 pounds to put on gondoliers, so Utopia Limited was 7,000 pounds. So it's a huge cast. It's fairly long, and Gilbert and Sullivan were sort of in a conflict avoidance mode, so it didn't get the benefit. They were usually pretty tough on each other, and that really made the shows better. In spite of all of that, it got a great review, and it ran for 245 performances, which was pretty respectable. The Times of London it said, happily, however, the occasion seems to have put each of the two, meaning Gilbert and Sullivan, upon his mettle, and the result is that the latest is also one of the best of the set since Mikado. Really? Better than Gondoliers, better than one of the Guard. Anyway, they really liked it. But being kind of expensive to put on, it never really got repeated after the initial run in England. Somehow it got more popular in the United States. Maybe it's because the references to the law and the government are so prominent. People ask me sometimes, how can these things that are poking fun at society and things that are going on in the Victorian era be of any interest or relevance today? And I say, yeah, you're right, understand. Mikado, for example, one of the big comic characters is someone who is kind of in it for his own personal gain. Who would do that in government now? Another one, characters all throughout Gilbert and Sullivan are appointed to government jobs with absolutely no experience? Well, certainly that couldn't happen today, could it? No. Utopia Limited, and we planned Utopia Limited long before the current interesting things that are happening and were happening in Madison started happening. And even the graphics with the palm trees, that have been, that predates. So one of the disclaimers, the whole current administration in Madison is not working for the Madison Savoyards as a PR operation. That's not true, although you may think so, because one of the funny bits in Utopia Limited, well, there was a new limited liability law in England at the time, and so Gilbert makes great fun of all of that and the evasion of personal responsibility. In fact, the characters in Utopia Limited are each individually registering themselves as companies limited, to avoid responsibility. Well, one of the first things in our new administration in Madison, they changed some of the liability laws and how that works and what companies are liable for and so on. It's just great. It just fits the plot so well, including, who could imagine this, that in normal times, but a key point in Utopia Limited is where two judges of the Utopian Supreme Court start acting out. Are they following our script? Wow. Well, and the punchline for Utopia Limited is, well, you've got this island someplace in the Pacific, and it's not clear where it is. It sort of feels a little like Hawaii or something. It's something on that order. Life is great. But the king wants it to be better. He sends his daughters off to England to learn all the social skills and so on. And they come back and they start doing everything English, adopting all the customs. And then it turns out that they're miserable because everything is perfect. The police have nothing to do. The lawyers have nothing to do. There's no divorce. There's no crime. There's no anything. It's just deadly dull. So, how to restore balance? How to bring it back? Well, they say, oh, we forgot one thing, the two-party system. Because one party will undo everything that the other party does. And then, so we'll have perpetual chaos. And so they do that, and everybody's happy. Well, of course, that doesn't have anything to do with current stuff, does it? Yeah. I think one of the geniuses of Gilbert and Sullivan, the reason that we're such big fans and love to do it, is Gilbert was had such insight into human nature. And that doesn't change a whole lot, it seems. That's something I think gets reinforced when you go see good Shakespeare. The basic humanity is unchanging, and when you can tap into that, which they do so well, and they present it in such a funny and light way, it's just marvelous. Let me just, you probably, unless you have a recording of Utopia Limited, or unless you remember well the Madison Savoyards, as far as I know, it's the only time it's been presented anywhere in the area, and I'm including, well, I think some amateur company in Chicago did it a few years ago, but it's just so rarely performed. Almost never in England, but a little bit more here. We did it in 1993 because it was the 100th anniversary of the first performance. And we're doing it again because our director, Terry Kiss Frank, just has a fondness for this piece and just loves it. But I'll play one short song. It's kind of this a bit of a patter song. This is King Paramount, and he's sort of going over all the misery that's been wrought by this too much perfection. And this is before they decide to go back to the two-party system. Well, you get the idea. It's the music is wonderful. The humor is weirdly current. I've left some brochures on the table that give the details of the performance times and dates, basically the last 2 weekends in July. I've left a few copies of our current newsletter, and we've got a poster from the original production. The original production, one reason it was so expensive was very elaborate sets. They've got a ballroom scene that they just went crazy with the new electric lighting and everything. That's one nice thing about an amateur company. The large cast doesn't cost us a lot more money. So that's maybe one reason we're able to do it. I also have a few of our DVDs if you're interested. We could sell you some. I got the Pinafore from last year and Yeoman of the Guard from the year before. I think I'll stop there to allow a little time for questions if you have any. Yes?
When they first started out, were people more attracted to them because of the fightiness for the government, which people always seem to welcome, or were they looked upon as really good opera plays?
Both. I think that's one of the music really is quite sophisticated, quite good. If John Barker were here, he could give you all the really subtle things in the music, little references to maybe Schubert something, and they do parody grand opera quite a bit in GNS. In fact, the stage directions were to sort of think of it as grand opera, let the humor sort of come out. And that's what we try to do with the Savoyards. So it's this combination of this incredibly witty and literate and funny libretto with this incredibly skilled music that combines to make a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. So it's both, really, I think. And it's just, when it's done with a good understanding of what it's all about, let the humor come out, let the writing come out. And one of the common things in a lot of productions that aren't so good is that it gets kind of slapstick, and some jokes are sort of emphasized and others disappear. You get the wrong impression. When you get a good production, it feels like something that was written yesterday, really. And that's what we're trying to do. Yeah. Question was whether it was the music or the words that were more interesting and or more attractive to people. But yeah, you'll find if you're not a Gilbert and Sullivan fan now, I do have to kind of give you a warning that it can become addictive. You'll find yourself humming as you're walking along or singing in the shower, and being on the board of the Savoyards is a lot of fun because sometimes we find ourselves trying to outdo each other quoting, and somebody will say, do you have any more information? And I'll come back and say, well, of course, let me add some corroborative detail intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. And we go on that way until yeah. Any other questions?
I have a friend ask you, what is the difference between opera and operettas? And I says, I don't know unless operettas are fun.
Well, that somehow in our group we've had that question go around for a long time. David Crosby was the orchestra director for the Savoyards for many years. In fact, the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra was the pit orchestra at one time for the Madison Savoyards. And going back in one of his old programs, he said, yeah, comic opera, light opera, operetta, what is it? And what he said was, why don't we do what Sullivan suggested and was agreed to by Gilbert and D'Oyly Carte, operas. Refer to them as Gilbert and Sullivan operas. Why? Because certainly the music is at least as high quality and sophisticated as any opera composer. The dialogue, my goodness, the lyrics are fantastic and better than most opera. The plots, well, if we're going to talk about believable plots, opera, really? Okay. So, and the production values, and the skill and the care that goes in and so on, they really, opera is the best term. And that's what at least I try to sell, and not everybody agrees, but I would say opera. But they're funny. It's opera that's a lot more fun to go to than some other operas. I maybe put it that way. Anything else? If not, well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.